My name is Jennifer Lewis. I'm the Deputy Director for the Anti-Corruption Task Force, focusing on our programs and in particular our efforts to counter corruption across sectors, or what we used to refer to as our integration agenda. I'll just start out by saying I've been so pleased to be able to participate in a number of panels and sessions this week that are focused squarely on this issue in individual sectors, and to work with many here who are in the audience and on this panel as well. We all know that this is a critical issue, that countering corruption is important to all of our work as development practitioners, no matter the sector, no matter the country context, et cetera. And you know, I'm very gratified on a personal level to see that this year's IACC has so heavily featured sessions that are about countering corruption in particular sectors. I think there's a growing consensus that corruption is really at the root of so many of our problems, and that countering corruption really is everyone's business. And I also have been gratified to hear how increasingly we are seeing communities of practice grow that are growing the nexus between the anti-corruption community and sectoral communities. But this session today takes a slightly different take. Today we're here to talk about partnerships that are multi-sectoral. This is about partnerships between sectors, between education and health and climate and agriculture, the full range of activities that might be built to sort of build the network that we need to counter corruption effectively from all angles. And I know I may be sort of preaching to the choir here, but I think it bears mentioning that we know that countering corruption is critical to delivering on our sustainable development mission. There is not one sector where corruption is not, if not but the most important obstacle to achieving our sectoral outcomes. And that is because it gets at the root of the promise of the resources that we as a development community and that countries themselves are putting forward to try to solve their most wicked development problems, whether it's in water and sanitation or access to justice. It is corruption that stands in the way of achieving these human outcomes. But it's also really important as an anti-corruption community to recognize that we cannot achieve our anti-corruption ambitions, that was a Freudian slip, our anti-corruption ambitions without working through sectors. We just simply cannot tackle it. We cannot throw up a procurement system and call it a day. We can't just work to strengthen investigation and enforcement and hope that stems the problem of corruption. We need to work through sectoral approaches. And I'll end by just saying that from a donor perspective, and many here are either from donors or work on programs funded by donors, this is especially important because it really doesn't matter what the color of the money is, right? We don't need to have an anti-corruption program, an anti-corruption funded program. What we need is all of our programs to have an open eye to the corruption context in which we are operating, to ensure that we are proactively seeking entry points to counter corruption as much as possible, and equally as important that our assistance is not inadvertently perpetuating or feeding into corruption dynamics. And so, socializing this problem set within our sectors is one of the key challenges we have ahead of us, making this emphasizing that corruption is an all of society problem that requires an all of society approach and that it is really everyone's business. So I'll make a shameless plug for our new USAID guide on countering corruption across sectors, which I'll note is just a first step in trying to unpack and understand this. We had fantastic collaboration with our colleagues from Global Health, of whom I have a representative here today joining me, who really led the development of a groundbreaking new handbook on countering corruption in the global health sector, which is so important. We know more needs to be done. On our end, I could just share that our plan is to roll out equally important, hopefully equally deep handbooks on climate, on economic growth, on education, on all the really critical sectors that we fund at USAID. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce my panel, I'd like to also just explain a little bit about how today will work, because we're trying to do something a little different. We're going to start out by doing some mini deep dives on 4 concrete examples of countering corruption across sectors, which these experts will present. And then we're going to move into a moderated discussion with the panelists, first about ways to build effective cross-sectoral partnerships, and second about spurring collective action on the ground. And the idea is really to unpack some of these obstacles and opportunities to working collaboratively. And then, because this session is about spurring collective action right here and right now, we will not be moving to a traditional Q&A session, but instead to a collective brainstorming about how this all happens. If we had been in a different room, the idea was to sit around tables and do this, but we're doing it differently, and we have an amazing virtual audience that we want to be able to include as well. So we're reserving the last 20 minutes of this session to co-create a collective action plan for countering corruption across sectors. So I'm just going to pose the questions that we're going to ask so you can think about them as you hear from our panelists, whether you're here or online, to be prepared as we ask the questions to you, which are, what are the entry points for partnership and collective action? And as we think of that, existing forums, communities of practice that we can leverage, et cetera, right? That's the first question. The second question is, what are 3 tangible, actionable next steps in your country context or in your sectoral context that would drive multi-sectoral partnership to counter corruption? And again, as part of that, thinking about outreach, communication, how we talk about this issue. So I'm now going to turn to the panelists who are the real reason you are here today. Very pleased to have Juhani Grossmann with us today. He's the team leader for the Green Corruption Program at the Basel Institute of Governance. Also joined by Becky Turner, who is the Senior Supply Chain Technical Advisor at USAID's Global Health Bureau. Also joined by Claire Schuten, who is the Senior Program Officer in the International Budget Partnership and a board member of COST. And finally, Virwit Tianqianan, Chief of Party for our USAID Mekong for the Future program. So we have a variety of sectors represented here today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from all of them. So we're first going to turn to a quick presentation by Claire.
Great, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me. It's such a pleasure to be here today. Thanks so much for being with us today too. So at the International Budget Partnership, we collaborate with budget analysts, community organizers, and advocates around the world to advance budget systems that work for all people. And I think as Jen highlighted, we know that corruption requires an all-hands-on-deck approach, as we like to call it. So no agency or institution alone has the ability to change the accountability culture anywhere. Instead, there must be sort of system-wide and multi-stakeholder approach involving executives, legislatures, auditors, civil society, and private sector actors working together across sectors, as we'll hear today, to advance accountable and equitable outcomes. So now we know such collaboration can take many forms. For example, we've been working with and fostering collaboration across supreme audit institutions and civil society to tackle critical issues in infrastructure, such as dilapidated schools affecting 4 million children in Tanzania, water and sanitation and hygiene facilities in schools in Sierra Leone, and the management of infrastructure funds and projects such as roads, water supplies, and sewage works in Nepal. And we've seen that across these countries, civil society and supreme audit institutions have shared evidence, including both the audits themselves, but also citizen-generated data and analysis, for example, of patronage networks that are fueling contracting systems, and sharing that evidence with anti-corruption oversight institutions and other legal authorities. They've leveraged the media to shine the light on problems and recommendations, and they've engaged affected communities, private sector actors or professional associations, various relevant ministries across sectors, and civil society networks at the national and subnational level to weed out mismanagement and irregularities and advance change in policy and practice. In Nepal, for example, the civil society and supreme audit institutions collaborated to strengthen the accountability of user committees responsible for infrastructure funds and projects. As highlighted in an audit report by the Office of the Auditor General, local representatives and politicians were using their influence to reap personal gains, such as appointing their aides in key positions, a lack of transparency of financial transactions and procurement that were happening, and selecting their own businesses as contractors. So the Supreme Audit Institution and civil society worked together to train journalists in the use of audits and other evidence. They engaged various parliamentary committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, the Finance Committee, political parties, and the National Procurement Agency. And these interventions helped ensure that the National Procurement Agency took both the Supreme Audit Institutions and civil society's inputs into account when it developed a unified guideline to reduce mismanagement and corruption in the use of those local development funds. The Ministry of Federal Affairs and Government Administration also formed a task force and met with civil society the Municipal Association of Nepal, and the National Association of Rural Municipalities, which is a national association of 753 local governments, to further resolve issues regarding the Case of User Committee's accountability. And collaboration across sectors is also at the heart of the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, also known as COST. And COST is a collective action initiative working with civil society, government, and the private sector, both at the global level, I represent civil society on the board, and across 20 national and subnational members across 4 continents. And it's this COST approach of disclosure, quality assurance, multi-stakeholder working, and social accountability that has yielded important dividends, such as cost savings of magnitude, more competitive bidding, and greater trust, and more efficient and effective infrastructure for millions of people. So we're seeing that such cases show that while the independence of accountability institutions is critical, it's that interconnectedness across sectors that bolsters the accountability system. And we all have a role to play in bolstering that system and improving services for those who need them most. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire. And I actually really love the fact that you brought in not just sectors as we define them, but sectors as in civil society sector and public sector. So that's fantastic. So next we'll hear from Vera about a really interesting example from the USAID program he manages.
Thank you very much, Jen. First of all, it's been a pleasure to be here. This is the 4th day, and actually, to me, speaking about this on this panel, this conference is actually self-evident in the fact that it's cross-sectoral. So we need everyone to be meeting together, talking together, and networking together in order to address and trying to find a solution to this world problem of corruption. At the projects that I'm leading as the chief of party is the USAID, the WWF, Mekong for the Future in the greater Mekong countries. So I'm leading the projects in the 5 countries comprised of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Thailand. The project is to strengthen civil society on natural resource governance. So as the name suggests, that the theory of change is that in order to have a better natural resource governance, it's important to involve civil society. But as we all know, the civil society is not in one unity. So there are sectors within civil society as well. So in order to work on the natural resource governance, so we have been working together with different civil society in the 5 countries that they are working not only on the environmental issues, but also on human rights, children's rights, women's, LGBT, worker rights, and so on. Because natural resource governance actually impacted us all, and not only one particular sector, like on the environmental sector. So women and children also have been gravely impacted by the issues of natural resource corruptions, as we are also the associate award of another USAID targeting natural resource corruptions. So we are addressing the issue of corruption by not really confronting corruption head on, but we're bringing corruptions as an issue that everyone kind of like aware of. To give you an example, I'm going to be a brief one, that we work together with the civil society in Laos. There's this big corporations coming in with a bag full of cash from the country up north, People's Republic of China. And they have been trying to buy their ways to get the land commissions from the Laos government. And they try to talk to the household owner that if they were willing to sign up to sell their land, they would be getting extra cash, like $10,000 each. But the people got together and then worked together with women associations and so on, so then they would be able to advocate against it. And then they would be able to bring in cross-sectoral support and advocacy to challenge this big corporation coming in. And finally, they won. So that's kind of like very remarkable, and that is what the USAID and the WWF have been supporting. To give you an example, so that's, I think that's maybe for me to start with, and then back to Jen. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I love that example. So we'll turn now to Becky for an example from the global health sector.
Thank you, Jen. And I want to echo what Vera said about the quality of this conference. I've also been surprised to learn from so many other sectors here on applicability and knowledge that's transferable that hadn't even crossed my mind. So I hope you've all shared that experience. In USAID's health sector, to address a wide range of corruption issues ranging from theft, leakage, falsification, and counterfeiting of health commodities, to flawed tender processes with suppliers or distribution agents during the procurement process, inflated and fraudulent billing for supplier or distribution contracts, and salary payments to ghost employees or even absenteeism. The Bureau for Global Health has deployed a framework for monitoring and mitigating supply chain risks, including those throughout our high investment, high risk, low and middle income countries, focusing on prevention and detection. Much of what we refer to as risk mitigation actions contribute either directly or indirectly to anti-corruption safeguarding. For example, physical inventory management, supplier and contract management, regulatory systems capacity strengthening, data transparency for triangulation and fraud detection, and procurement process standard operating procedure reforms. We recognize the need for shifting our technical assistance approaches in view of the fact that some corrupt practices we identify involve organized crime that's often transnational in nature and is benefiting from complicity at the highest level of power and influence. Such practices require more than capacity development and technical training measures to address them. In this way, we've also developed an internal playbook to document best practices for addressing and mitigating these risks and creating smart deterrents, such as flags and checks within e-procurement systems. And we've also launched a practical guide which allows us, following the detection of corruption or alleged corruption, to equip our mission staff around the world with tools and practical avenues for directly addressing the corrupt practices in the case that preventative measures and safeguarding against those actions didn't prove effective. I should note here that in the development of the practical guide, we were able to bring together voices from different sectors across our agency, including acquisition, governance, humanitarian, and behavioral sciences colleagues, so that all of those experiences are reflected in what practitioners may reach for in their toolbox to fight corruption. On the ground, we're expanding our partner base as well to include others beyond public health sector for follow-on action and accountability. Standard practice within global health's programs has been for us to conduct supply chain assurance reviews, as well as partner with manufacturers to conduct back tracing to identify theft and leakage from the public to private sectors, coordinating with other donors as well. But we're now exploring, in coordination with our Chief Financial Office, opportunities to secure our technical assistance investments and partner government capacity strengthening by integrating auditing principles from the financial sector and those practices as well into public sector internal controls, standards, and processes. Beyond countering corruption on the mitigation front, when USAID donated commodities being sold in private markets, which are intended for the public sector, are found and determined, we're leveraging existing structures and broadening partnerships that go beyond the health sector, directly engaging law enforcement to enhance pharmaceutical investigative capacity in countries where we work, as well as the prosecutorial divisions that may not have trained specialists on how to identify fraud and corruption in the health sector, together with our USG interagency partners for follow-on action and accountability post-identification of corruption. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Becky. I think you got a taste there of some of the really innovative work that they're doing in health in terms of this cross-sectoral piece. It's fantastic. All right, so we'll have one last example from Juhani from the Natural Resource Climate sector.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here and have this cross-sectoral conversation. I've been scribbling notes because it seems like there's a lot of lessons learned already from the different sectors that we have presented here. So under the program that I work on, which focuses on environmental corruption, we've been piloting the adaptation of tools that are probably quite familiar to many of you in the room, such as corruption risk assessments, internal controls reviews, political economy analyses, specifically to environmental and wildlife agencies. And this was an effort that's almost 2 years running, supported by USAID's Targeting Natural Resource Corruption program. And there's a few sort of lessons learned that I want to share with you in that process. So initially, we started out, as every good program that assesses corruption risks does, by looking at the political environment through PAs. And what we wanted to focus on in particular were the law enforcement functions of these environmental agencies. As you may perhaps know, that is sort of one of the distinguishing features of the environmental sector, is that many of their environmental agencies, especially in Africa, have now acquired various degrees of law enforcement capacity. And so we wanted to get a sense for what the corruption risks in these processes are. And we looked at Malawi, Uganda, and Peru in that process. And so the PAs originally very quickly showed that there is a confluence of external factors that are influencing the law enforcement decision-making. This, not terribly surprising to those of you who have conducted these kind of researches. But what was surprising to us is when we started mapping, as any good CRA requires, you have to map the processes, right? So we started mapping the law enforcement processes, and we thought this would be a very easy thing because, you know, they're criminal justice procedures. They should be pretty strictly scripted, one would hope. And everybody we talked to had a different impression about who makes the decision where in that chain, which is probably not what you want in a criminal justice process. So that was somewhat surprising to us, how unscripted the decision-making was, especially about how to progress cases or stop progressing cases. And for those of you who have done CRAs, your red lights are starting to flash, I imagine, at this stage. We then talked to the various respondents engaged in these law enforcement functions to get a sense of what the main risks were that they perceived. And, you know, as usual, there's many different risks. You have to sort of weed through the data and try and figure out which ones are most prevalent, which ones are most impactful, which ones are most likely to occur, and then you prioritize them. So we did all that. And then we took a breather, and we tried to look at this risk from a different perspective, and that's the internal controls perspective, and getting a sense for how able these agencies, these wildlife agencies we were working with, are able to control their own risks. And here for us was really quite a shocking revelation, I have to say, is that there is sort of a veneer of accountability and internal control, functioning internal controls, but it is very, very thin. And so for example, they would say, oh, we have an internal controls committee, or we have an integrity committee even. We said, that's wonderful. Who is on the committee? Not sure. When have they met? Not sure. Have they ever met? Not sure. So, and this was a story that repeated itself again and again in country after country. And so what we realized is that really we shouldn't be all that surprised, frankly, that we have high degrees of corruption in the environmental sector, because the internal controls, at least in the 3 countries that we looked at, are absolutely minimal. And they're typically put in place at the behest of donors, as a sort of fig leaf that, you know, corruption is being addressed. And so for us, this was really an important takeaway, and we've since designed follow-on programming to ensure that those internal controls are significantly strengthened. In particularly, Malawi is at sort of the forefront of this, where we give them a 14-point action plan, and they looked at it for about an hour or so, and they said, right, let's do it. So we're very excited to be following up on that activity. So hopefully at the next IACC I'll have more to tell you about how difficult it is to implement internal controls in wildlife agencies. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. So we've now heard from our four panelists 4 different examples and multiple examples within that actually of some of this cross-sectoral collaboration and what it's looked like in particular sectors. We're going to move into a moderated panel discussion. We've had a lot of people join us since I introduced the way this panel will work. So bear with me for one moment to just remind everyone that we're going to have a discussion now with some questions that I'll pose to the panelists. But then we're going to move, rather than into a traditional Q&A, into collective brainstorming on what an action plan for collective action could look like in terms of building these cross-sectoral partnerships. And so as you think about these questions, we actually have some questions that we will be asking you. And thanks very much to my colleague Mariam for pulling together a Menti poll, which we will put up in a moment on the slide. And that way, those of you online will also have the ability to go ahead and put your questions, and rather your responses, not your questions. We are asking you questions, your responses in so we can have a good conversation about next steps. So I'd like to focus this first panel discussion on some of the barriers and incentives to partnership across sectors. So Becky, in your experience, what are some of these barriers and barriers, but also opportunities to building active partnership across sectors, for example, between actors working in health, as you mentioned, but in education or other sectors, and how might we tackle them?
Thanks, Jen. And just to start with a disclaimer that the following does reflect some of my own opinion and not necessarily the views of USAID. So barriers to building partnership across sectors really tends to mirror some of the same challenges that we face to building partnership within our own sector. So to start, there's a notion that anti-corruption efforts are so sensitive, and sharing information to be able to facilitate successful or effective collaboration is more of a barrier. So there is that perception. But for USAID's Bureau for Global Health, this has meant for us fortifying our working relationship with our Office of the Inspector General to clarify data sharing premises and the limitations thereof, ensuring that we preserve and consolidate our U.S. government advances in this space while also providing meaningful information and learning throughout our international development efforts. So it's actually an opportunity. It's more about learning what the parameters are around what can and cannot be shared to varying degrees, and then channeling that relevant information contextualized by audience to actors and parties who can maximize actionable responses. We have, even internally, challenges with the way our funding streams and mandates are structured that can make incentivizing cross-sectoral collaboration and performance management of those approaches challenging. So we're now considering at the strategic level what it may mean to develop multi-sectoral development objectives that joins together varying and hybrid funding streams and funding mechanisms in the anti-corruption space that allow us to galvanize learning and foster an environment for technical advisors and partners from different sectors, like that of education, to engage in the same sandbox, if you will. The strides also that the energy sector has made in identifying beneficial ownership and engaging with Treasury and Ministries of Finance are certainly an impetus for us to look to deploy similar measures within our technical assistance to host and partner governments in assessing beneficial ownership in the pharmaceutical space. For example, private sector pharmacies, distributors, importers, and suppliers that receive government contracts. Another barrier would be within the health sector, we've not historically referred to our efforts to advance transparency and data quality within pharmaceutical procurement as countering corruption or anti-corruption safeguarding. So we had not recognized the efforts of our partners in renewable energy, infrastructure, education, water, and food security, looking also to safeguard public resources as opportunities for cross-pollination and sharing learning. So I think it's critical that we look across the aisle to marry these learnings from those efforts which can be considered transferable. A few for us, which include public financial management, social accountability and interventions, and civil society engagement. And lastly, I would say the time and resources needed to understand how to engage entities operating within processes, timelines, nomenclature, or jargon that's very different from our own can be perceived or is a barrier. However, I think there's an opportunity here to move to focus less on our technical differences in the content of the services we're providing and more on the structures and processes that enable us to work together to bring projects and services to fruition, which requires investing in the time it takes to do this as an opportunity cost for our organizations and our staff to come up to speed with how other sectors and entities are working, but well worth it.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was so eloquent and well laid out. I love the focus on cross-pollination, but also some of these common approaches. This is something we did also try to lay out in our guide, which was what are some of these common entry points across sectors where you can galvanize collective action, whether it's on PFM or procurement or some of these other common entry points, opportunities for corruption, but also opportunities for action. So I'll turn now to Juhani. A similar question, especially in sort of the wicked problem space, such as climate and others. What are some opportunities to build active partnership, and why or where do we still have barriers?
Yeah, thank you. So in my sector, there's certainly quite a lot of reluctance. Historically, there's been tremendous amount of reluctance, both from the corruption agencies that I've worked with to focus more on natural resource issues because it's not seen as particularly attractive, largely because of I think, misunderstanding of the value of the environment and the fact that a lot of the anti-corruption investigations are very heavily focused on cash and size of bribes and things like that. But also from the conservation community, we've seen a lot of reluctance historically because there's concern that addressing corruption with their partners might undermine their conservation objectives. It's hard to find two more passionate crowds than anti-corruption folks and conservation folks. So when they come together, sometimes there's some sparks. But I'm very happy to say that in the last maybe year and a half, 2 years, that has really changed quite cardinally. I don't know what it is about being stuck at home that makes us realize that working together is more important suddenly. We'll find, or perhaps because of the climate crisis becoming more intense. But there is really a tremendous amount of openness now, both among sort of leading organizations in both sectors, as well as practitioners on the ground. And so one more plug for those of you who haven't heard it, that there is a practitioners forum, in fact, that was announced on Tuesday. It's founded by WWF, Traffic, Transparency International, and the Basel Institute. It's funded by USAID and Principality of Liechtenstein at this stage, and in fact, we just received some additional funding to host some activities by the UK government. So it's really exciting how it's coming together. We had a very intense conversation yesterday, trying to start to brainstorm what to focus on, and it's a very target-rich environment. Let's say many things to highlight. The other thing that I wanted to just mention briefly is that one of the sectors that we haven't talked about here is state-owned enterprises, and I hope there are no state-owned enterprise representatives here, because I am very concerned about the growing role of state-owned enterprises, especially in the natural resource sector. A lot of the countries that I work in are increasingly dominated by state-owned enterprises in that space, and their not just capacity to manage corruption, but even their desire to manage corruption is very, very limited in what I've seen. I worked in Indonesia for a long time, and they're sort of synonymous with corruption, unfortunately. And I think that's one of the areas where sort of development development programming support has really been quite weak. Perhaps because they're very daunting and complex, but I think it's not an issue we can continue shying away from.
Thanks so much, Juhani. I love the idea of sparks flying between the NRM community and AC community. That's amazing. So actually you sort of teed up, although we're not necessarily talking about SOEs here today, but the idea of sort of the incentives to engage in this work, and that actually leads exactly to the question I wanted to ask Vera, which is, as someone who's been working at this nexus for years, what do you see not just as the entry points, but what are the incentives to cross-sectoral partnership in countering corruption? And in particular, how do we bring in more diversity in terms of bringing in more groups that are working on different issues? You mentioned some of the women's groups and so on, but how do we bring them and involve them in the fight against corruption?
Okay. Thank you, Jen. I will try to be concise to give you this long story, but it's about a Thai company, a Thai sugar company, wanted to invest in Cambodia. And I'm speaking of this as I was involved at the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand as a human rights expert before I joined as a chief of party for this project. There was this petition that was been submitted by the Cambodian CSO to the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand that a Thai sugar company trying to grab the land that belonged to the communities by getting the concession from the Cambodian government. And we had an inquiry, so we invited the sugar company, which is a publicly listed company, quite a big one. I'm not going to name the name in order to avoid the lawsuit. But they actually explained that they got this fair and square. I mean, they got it from the government. There was no corruption involved, no money involved, but they just win the bidding, which is only one bidder. So kind of like strange, right? But anyway, we have been pursuing the lawsuits in the Cambodian court, but then it didn't work so well because of the system there. So then we kind of bringing in additional CSO groups, trying to work on the lobbyings also with the Thai court and trying to take the case to the Thai court. And we did. So we got another group of CSO, and then that also did not work so well. So then we're bringing in the media, NGOs, and also the media agency journalists who are working on investigative journalists. So they did the story on it and then disseminated it to the mainstream media. So that helped bringing the issues to the agenda. And after that, we have been thinking that it may not really got their attention that much. So then we try to work with the financial institution because they are publicly listed company, and also the pension funds of Thailand. So then we had a meeting with them and then told them about this lawsuit that they are having in Cambodia and also in Thailand. And they were interested, so they had a call with the company that, I mean, if this is going on, that might affect the credibility of the company. On top of that, we're also working with international CSO because we know that sugar need to be bought by some of the company. And one of the big company that purchase sugar like Coca-Cola. So then we had discussion with them, and then Coca-Cola sent them some information that if this going on, that might impact their credibilities, and they might not be able to buy the sugar from the company. At the end, the Thai sugar company then decided that they would no longer pursue that, so they just drop it. They said they want the bidding, but they are not going to pursue it. So that gives you the example of what the incentive of bringing in different factors to work together and then making the impact. Thank you.
It's a fantastic example. Thank you so much, Vera. So we got one more question in this round, and it's for Claire, which is from your vantage point both at IBP but also as a board member at COST. What role do international standards and organizations play in cultivating more active partnerships across sectors to counter corruption? And also, what are some of the limitations of this role?
Great, no, thank you. Just briefly, when we analyzed some of the triggers of greater fiscal accountability, there were 4 that came up. So thinking about political transitions and the opportunities that those create, thinking about fiscal and economic crises. I think we've all seen how COVID crisis has been obviously a horrible experience, but also has raised opportunities for further collaboration. Cases of corruption, which I think we all know about, but that can help foster different reform efforts. And then external influences, but combined with domestic reformers. And I think those external influences can include international standards. We've talked in COST in the context of the infrastructure data standard, which has helped raise flags that merit further investigation and collective action. Many standards across the UN and international transparency initiatives, of course. At the IBP, we developed the Open Budget Survey, which reflects international standards from the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, as well as a global initiative for fiscal transparency. And in turn, this assessment of budget transparency, public participation throughout the budget process, and the role of oversight institutions is being used by international actors. It's shaping international programming decisions in countries. It's being used as eligibility criteria for the Open Government Partnership and other areas. But importantly, it's being used to guide reforms at the country level, which can then contribute to reducing corruption, boosting revenues, and improving services. So we've seen that international organizations and broader initiatives can play a role, a brokering role, for example, bringing actors together, as we see in the case of Supreme Audit Institutions and civil society, who might not necessarily have the habit of talking together. Likewise, we've been bringing public financial management actors together with social movements and broader coalitions who, again, have not interacted. So we have to be cautious, of course, analyze the political economy, but that can be an opportunity. Of course, in addition to providing the assistance, technical assistance, and financial assistance that we've heard about, as well as documenting and facilitating that learning, helping that iterative, adaptive learning process. And we've also seen that ultimately, again, we need to be all together in this process, and that ultimately the global norms and those players can play a role, but they need to be empowering the domestic reformers and not undermining them. So excited to engage further going beyond those usual suspects and how we can build broad alliances for change.
Great, thank you so much. So we've been talking about ways to build partnerships, cross-sectoral partnerships, and we're going to move into the second round of questions here, which is really about how we actually promote collective action on the ground. Before that, I just want to remind everyone that we're doing a Menti poll because, again, we're going to be asking you for your inputs, not the other way around. It's posted here for our participants online. You're able to participate as well, and then we'll do readouts as possible. So on collective action, Vera, we throw that term around a lot, but how do you define collective action against corruption, and what does it look like in terms of concrete examples?
Yes, thank you. Just like to give the example of what we are doing right now in the ASEAN regions, the Southeast Asian associations. The project USAID and WWF, we have been working with the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and then we are working on drafting of the first regional instruments on environmental rights, and that will include the terms and also the conditions on what kind of transboundary investment that would have an impact on the environment and the communities would also be addressed. And we are approaching this to the human rights-based approach to the anti-corruption. So we're bringing in civil society, people from different groups. I was actually, I think 3 weeks ago, in the working group meeting where we invited representatives from different sectors like women, children, people with disabilities, and so on. So then they will be part of this working group that we would be able to bring in, and then having these collective actions that we would be able to propose this regional instrument to the ASEAN. And if it's adopted by the ASEAN Summit, by the ASEAN Summit, then this will become the first regional instrument on the environmental rights. So that's kind of like to give you an example of how we would be able to bring in civil society, private sectors will also involve as well, the governments, and also the regional body to work together, and then they would be able to have some actions that would be able to level the playing field, prevent corruption from happening, and then trying to reduce what have been happening through the transboundary investment in the region. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Juhani, from your perspective, and you've worked on this issue for a long time in terms of promoting some of this policy collaboration, and you mentioned whether the uptake, maybe it was COVID and everyone going stir crazy, or finally being aware that we're in an existential climate crisis. But taking it beyond the policy level, how can we translate the kind of, agreement we have at a forum like this into concerted action on the ground? And what are some examples that you've seen that have worked in terms of that translation?
So I guess one of the lessons that I've learned doing this now for going on 3 years is that when we try to enter the sorts of the community that we're partnering with, so in my space, the conservation community, and we try to sort of force wholly new approaches and systems, that's rarely successful. And so in the last year or so, what we've done is we've really taken a step back and understand better what are the existing collective action efforts in the environmental space, what are the existing efforts that are quasi-anti-corruption efforts that we might be able to engage in and strengthen. And so, for example, many countries now have sort of intergovernmental committees to combat environmental crime or wildlife crime more specifically. And so those forums exist to varying degrees of intensity, but these are already, environmental folks concerned with crime. So it's not a very far stretch for them to also start looking at corruption, since that's also a crime in most places anyway. And so establishing things like subcommittees on these, or bringing in special cases related to corruption, has been far more productive than trying to set up wholly new structures, in my experience. The other thing that I've noticed, coming back to the state-owned enterprise question, in Indonesia, it's a particularly interesting example where there is lots and lots of state-owned enterprises that are going through all sorts of mergers and acquisitions and regroupings that are, partially business-driven but partially politically driven, of course. And so when Claire was talking about opportunities and seizing them, that really reminded me of this example where when I was in Jakarta a few weeks ago, we were talking to a bunch of these compliance officers at these state-owned enterprises, and they're saying, this is such a difficult time for us. We have all these other state-owned enterprise that are being merged with our entity. It's a political decision. There's no due diligence. We're really worried about all the corruption risks. And we said, interesting. Now that you care about this issue, let us tell you about all these things that we can do to help you out with. But that's a very narrow window of opportunity that you really have to, seize when you have those opportunities. And of course, I think one thing that we really can't forget about is that as funds are going to have already started to some extent, but are going to increasingly start sort of gushing into the environmental sector, and all sorts of all sorts of coordination fora are being designed to handle those funds, either on the donor side or on the implementer side, or among civil society side, government side. One of the things that I'm concerned about is that corruption prevention is not a sufficiently important topic on the agenda. So I've been pitching this at a few fora this week, that I'm really a strong advocate of governments, especially donors who are, we had the recent COP meeting about all sorts of talks about climate remediation funds and transfers being made, that there's a lot of anti-corruption conditionality in those transfers and budget support efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Juhani. Very interesting, and you've recognized very importantly, I think, the challenge here in really translating this into effective change at the ground. Claire, from your vantage point, what cross-cutting approaches could help actors that are engaged in collective action already best tackle corruption from their perspectives?
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's been great to hear the reflections today. I think we've been also thinking about bringing different actors together to have these conversations and analyze the field that we're in, and think about some of the dimensions that could perhaps help us all as we act collectively. And there are a few points around that. So we were thinking about how can we incorporate inclusion and equity in these discussions of anti-corruption and accountability, because often we find that the coalitions or the ecosystems that are ensuring accountability around procurement or sectoral budgets or climate finance are the same actors that we need to follow the money or ensure that corruption is prevented and that we are ensuring that resources reach marginalized communities. So that's one element. Another way is thinking about integrating revenue and spending work. So we talk about extractives, we talk about infrastructure. We can be thinking a bit more about how we can connect the dots across revenue and spending. So for example, developing strategies for generating informal and formal revenue, thinking about the link between working on spending, revenue, and debt, and connecting that with public services. So these kinds of links are helping us connect with different communities. We're also thinking about how can we galvanize, as we discussed, civic engagement and supporting broad-based organizing. So again, thinking about how the supply of information, beyond the sort of proactive information, can also help provide that specific information needed for specific campaigns. Or we can be thinking about collective efforts around pure public goods like air and climate and water, for example. So thinking about how we can connect across those areas. Finally, we have a few other ideas, but just thinking about how we build the governance infrastructure for fiscal accountability. So thinking, again, I mentioned supreme audit institutions, but how do we work better with legislatures, judicial systems, ombuds offices, human rights commissions, and other similar institutions, and then ensuring that they have the constitutional responsibilities and the independence, the funding to be able to work in partnership with us as well. And finally, we're excited about experimenting around participation. So we look at it in terms of formal mechanisms to participate throughout the budget process, for example, but how can we enhance those informal collaborations across different sectors, across coalitions, and across change agents in government and beyond. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great points about galvanizing civic organizing. So the final question here for the panel is for Becky, and it's sort of internal focused, but maybe speaking as a donor. How can we take a collective action approach to countering corruption in our programming? So what does this mean, for example, in the health space in terms of actually bringing in more actors?
Thanks, Jen. USAID's health sector has been proactively engaging multilateral partners as well as civil society, working to align and combine our efforts in the health space, leveraging best practice and instilling a stronger together, more united approach to anti-corruption. For example, within the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, together with a partner agency in the UN system, we've been working to conduct internal landscape analyses to better understand how we are using terminology, jargon, definition, and defining our safeguarding support and international assistance, specifically in the public procurement space, so that we're well positioned to synergize together with this multilateral partner technical interventions in a way that proactively mitigates the risk of pharmaceutical procurement irregularity, overpaying for pharmaceuticals, and fraud. Also, having focused most heavily to date on risk and loss due to diversion, theft, and counterfeiting of health commodities, we're actually beginning to expand our efforts beyond traditional health programming into countering corruption through strengthening supreme audit institutions, as Claire mentioned, public financial and procurement systems, as well as enhancing downstream social accountability and civil society engagement within our health systems. And this really means engaging subject matter expertise from other sectors and applying that expertise within the health sector. Additionally, and to facilitate collective action, we're harmonizing terminology, how we define, monitor, and measure intervention effectiveness and our learning with proactive engagement during specifically the design phase of our programming, together with other donors. From financial and trade sectors to prevent duplicative efforts and reinventing the wheel, so to speak. A tangible example of that is that even now, USAID's Global Health Bureau is working with the International Federation of Accountants, the Global Fund, and the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi, following Administrator Powers signing a Memorandum of Understanding toward alignment on bolstering financial audit for fraud detection within the health sector, looking to build out professionalization and capacity strengthening as well for the supreme audit institutions, but together with public accountancy organizations that may have focused predominantly on the energy sector in the past, and to now integrate health sector specific fraud into their auditing functions. We could also look to build out avenues for sharing the known entities involved in illicit activities within each of our sectors, noting that many institutions identify these entities through their own internal controls and procurement disclosure processes, especially in developing countries where there's an absence of public beneficial ownership registries. so that we don't each have to find out on our own within one sector that we're dealing with bad actors, or even transcending sectors in recognition that organized crime is often cross-sectoral. If our fight against corruption remains siloed and sector-specific, I think we miss a huge opportunity to build coalitions and leverage each other's experiences that can enhance and optimize our own understanding and oversight of these cross-cutting issues, allowing for improved lines of communication, especially with law enforcement, to be able to maintain the focus of our technical aims, which in our space means improving health outcomes and saving lives. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Becky. Really great ideas, I think, that lead us right into this next session, which again, if we'd been in a different room, our goal had been to be at tables and have breakout rooms, but we have a virtual audience as well, so hopefully this works as well. We do have the Menti poll live. For those that are not familiar with Menti, you go to the website, www.menti.com, and you include this code to be able to answer the question. I'm sorry about the projection. It's a little hard to read that, I think. But we have a lot of really great ideas coming in as we think about how we leave today with some ideas about what collective actions we can start taking now in terms of building some of these things. And before we get into some of these answers, I'm just going to pull out a few things that I think we have talked about today and I think are coming across in some of these responses, which is using some of the existing networks and building additional ones, right? And so I won't go into those ones, but I do want to read out some of the ones just for the benefit of those who may have a hard time reading this screen that are coming in. So one response was that we can strengthen our current work on corruption risks and management across a variety of sectors. So that as a common approach that could be used in water, energy, food, environment, and the nexus between them. So what are the risks of corruption? We also had another one come in around similarly drawing illustrative maps of some of the corruption systems, but also some of the corruption risks that exist in some of these sectors, drawing on available evidence to demonstrate that corruption is not just a series of isolated incidents, right, but is actually a web. And this is something that, from a personal perspective, I'd like to really highlight. I think this is really important to note that corrupt actors will find whatever opportunity they can. And if the best entry point is through pharmaceuticals fraud, or the best entry point is through bribing for mining concessions or anything else, they will find it. And often these are potentially overlapping networks that are linked to transnational organized crime. But even when they are not, they often are the same actors and they are preying on the same governance weaknesses. So I do think that that is an important piece. I'm going to read a few more and then we're going to open it up for people who don't want to use the Menti poll as well. A lot of people pointed out beneficial ownership transparency. It's obviously been a huge topic at this conference today and something that I think is an important starting point, not ending point, in terms of really disclosing who the actors are in these sectors. You know, who are these companies, who are these organizations that are involved, and disclosing them. And hopefully, eventually moving to the point where that information is interoperable. So actually we are able to track these actors across sectors. There's a couple of comments here on building anti-corruption expressly into current processes and programs in the humanitarian space, development programming space. That's something we're looking at USAID. I know other donors are as well, sort of how you mainstream it and require some understanding and assessment of corruption as you look to program in a particular sector. So as we're looking in the energy sector, not just blindly going in, but really understanding the operating context in which we are deploying this assistance. There's a couple of comments here on drawing beyond the usual suspects in the anti-corruption space, and that's something we've been talking about right here. We've had a few examples about bringing in folks, whether it's women's groups, so some of the unusual suspects who are natural allies in the fight against corruption, but who may not feel like they have permission to enter our anti-corruption space, but really bringing them in as partners in this fight. A great comment here on engaging more culture workers in the arts, music, theater, online influencers, educators to use arts and education in a way that instills values of anti-corruption, but also promotes greater awareness, right, of what is happening. And this is often, I think, an untapped thing, especially those of us who might be working on sort of the illicit finance piece of things. But like, how do you translate follow the money in whatever sector into something that's meaningful to communities and to people who are experiencing this? So we have a bunch of other ideas, and I will try to figure out a way to capture this. Maybe there's a way to share this more broadly. But I think we'd like to open it up now if folks have ideas about what would be some concrete actions that if we walk out today with 3 steps that we could agree on, what are some things that we could put into practice today? And those of you online, please feel free to put your answers into the chat, and we'll be getting that. I think we have some microphones going around. Raise your hands high so I can hear. Okay. Right here. This gentleman in the hat. I think he had his hand up first. Oh, no hat. Okay. No hat.
No, no.
Okay, thank you. So I had him speak about collaboration. And,
I'm sorry. Could you identify if you're from an organization, but also if you represent a sector? That would be great.
Okay, that's fine. I'm Chukwuma from Okenwa. That's from the CSO, Executive Director, Lead Network. I also work with the government. I was recently appointed by the state government to a board. So I've been thinking, and having been there and there, looking at it from 2 angles, and the way government in Nigeria view those from CSOs as enemies. I'm wondering, are there programs like where such kind of collaborations are sought for to see those from the civil society as partners of progress? Educating government officials also, because sometimes I see that when you want to fight corruption, you end up fighting people, right? So, but then when those of them, the political actors, have that understanding, that we are partners in progress, because I've been in some forums, they said those of them in the CSOs are agents of destabilization. And then number 2, apart from some of those periodic engagement by USAID to ensure that there is collaboration among CSOs, I'm just wondering, are there, he mentioned about the course you have with the Institute of Basel, but specific courses targeted for CSOs, to educate them sustainably, maybe over a month's period where we could reflect, maybe take some exams to promote collaboration, because the level of collaboration we see often from my own country as a case study from CSOs is coming together to make a press statement, and I think that's not good enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I can
You
go.
wanted to take that?
Yeah, I'd like to give an example of an approach we took in Malawi. And so it was a civil society organization that worked together with the local community to create what they referred to as social accountability clubs. But rather than creating a scenario in which you have people in the community reporting on, and the scope of their work was to ensure the availability of pharmaceuticals at the facility at the lowest level, right, in their community. But instead of having a situation where they would have to be reporting to the supervisor at the clinic on the subordinate that they saw take the medicine, the structure took into account human nature, right, to your point, and made a hotline approach with direct linkage to the district level that was above the community level to create that space. And that really synergized and provided a forum for responding to the theft and leakage that was going on at the community level, because the district wanted to exert control, especially if their subordinates were enriching themselves unfairly.
So that brings out an important topic, kind of maybe around a safe space to allow actors to engage in a way that still allows them to live in their communities on a day-to-day basis while dealing and tackling with some of these issues. Let's see here. Liz, I think you were next.
Hi, good morning. This has been a great discussion so far. I lead the Targeting Natural Resource Corruption project at the World Wildlife Fund, so we're kind of on the front lines of cross-sectoral work. A couple of things that I would just bring from our experience. The points have already been made, but just really looking at this from where we've been working with the conservation community. Terminology, definitions, really being clear about what the scope of anti-corruption is, Becky, as you were already mentioning, is just so important. when people hear the term anti-corruption, they think a lot of different things. And it's really important to start with some understandings of, it's not always law enforcement, it's not always investigations, it's not always being the enemy of government, but sometimes it is as well. It's many different things. So I think that's just enormously important for us to realize that we've got some foundational work to do there on those kinds of things, and I think someone also brought that up on the screen as well. Recognizing that some existing approaches within the sector are actually part of anti-corruption work. Becky, you also mentioned that, and that's just enormously important. The kinds of community empowerment work, social accountability, things like that that people don't always think of as anti-corruption actually are, if you're not sort of steeped in this discussion of everything that could be anti-corruption. And then, Jen, you just mentioned a safe space for civil society. I think there's also a need for a safe space for implementers and funders to talk about this issue, and I noticed that was also up on the screen, and it just really hit home with me. There are times when working on anti-corruption can make it difficult to work with government, for instance, just depending on where you are, and allowing the realization and the recognition of that, and that sometimes the path to a sectoral outcome might be kind of a longer one if you're gonna do some corruption issues along the way, and be honest about those. So many other things we could talk about, but those are three things that we've really seen just doing this work in the cross-sectoral space with the environment and anti-corruption.
Great, thank you. We'll take a few more here, and I don't know if we have any online. I do want to highlight something that's coming on the Menti poll, which I think is another one to just throw in here since it may have come from an online participant, which is bringing in the private sector by disseminating amongst countries some of this data and information we are gathering at the sectoral level about the losses that they are suffering from corruption, and some of the intelligence, frankly, that we have on the ground about what that impact is. Okay, I'll open it up to anybody else. Let's see here. I think you had your hand up.
Hi, my name is Matt Aubrey. I'm the Executive Director for the Organization for Responsible Governance in the Bahamas, and we work on this. And I think, overall of this, I think you said this in the beginning, context is absolutely critical. So my perspective is coming from a small island developing state, population of 400,000, and so lots of the bigger picture established things we're still working on, finding that space. I was particularly struck by the comments that I think Claire maybe made related to the top 4 things that move for fiscal transparency. And outside of political transition, all of those things were kind of outside of our locus of control, right? So disasters and things that we can't, and then the accident has happened, so then the stop sign goes up. So thinking about again how we foster that internal agency to be able to move forward. Governments, particularly our governments, are very politically driven. So unfortunately, the topic of corruption being fostered or driven from a government can easily be brought forward as a political agenda instead of national development. So my thoughts around how we do that is crucial to build trust. Trust is essential. Equity, inclusion, access, consistency, and time. Time is crucial. So to build on what was stated before, that foundational work on building partnership, understanding capacity, and not just the technical expertise, but making sure that there are resources. The folks that are coming from those marginalized communities to give up a day or participate, what that means in their lives is significantly different than maybe a not-for-profit that has gotten resources or a government person that is their actual job. So factoring in that is crucial. So we have to start the lead time a lot earlier. So a lot of my suggestions are on that space, building the agency capacity and the interest of citizens to participate in this space. Being more prescriptive maybe about the engagement process when you're talking about implementation or monitoring. So governments can tick off that I did meet with civil society, but that's such a broad description. What does that really mean? What tools, what surveys, what door-to-door aspects can actually help to establish that there is more meaningful participation? placement of folks from those various sectors on the implementation and monitoring structure, I think, is crucial. And then the general theme I think we keep hearing is more formative involvement. So not once it's been established, but when a country is working on this, getting those groups in and getting their perspectives is crucial. For us, I think that foundational work, even though we're dealing with immediate issues, is going to be the long-term sustainability payoff for us. Because I think we can address crisis in the immediate, but it doesn't stick.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Peter Evans. I'm the director of the U4 Anti-Corruption Resource Centre. And I hope it's not too boastful to say that, Jen, the thing you read out about a graphic summary of corruption systems was my hobby. So I read that. When I heard the speaker speaking, I was mentally making kind of system maps of, the sugar example, the Thai Sugar Company, health, supply chains, natural resources, etc. So I was thinking in these systems. And I think it's useful because it means that corruption is not seen as a series of isolated incidents, but actually you see not least the political actors at play who will be connected, looking for opportunity, may be the same partners that we see in daylight, also operating in darkness. So I find systems thinking really useful. We've done some work in U4 on education to try and understand things like teacher absenteeism, exploitation of children, including girls and women, sextortion, paying for places at teacher training college, paying for postings, etc. And it's amazing how when you start laying out the system, you see it's by no means a simple thing, which is also partly why it's been so intractable. The final point I'd make, so I'd love to see more of this sort of graphic representation of corruption systems in all of our sectors and also how they cross over. The final point I'll make, I began my work when I worked for DFID in Malawi, not least in the health sector. And so some of the issues that were persistent in Malawi in drug supply 20 years ago, I know from recent research are still there. And the estimates of losses in Malawi's pharmaceutical supplies are still about, I think, 28% recent data. And also evidence that is organized. So it's not just pilfering at local level, it's actually a large-scale cross-border export of government drugs. So sometimes I think we can focus on the problem that emotionally we're most connected with, but actually stepping back and looking at systems and using, this research used radio tracking of pharmaceutical boxes, suddenly you see actually it's not just a capacity constraint or a local failure or need not greed. It's actually an organized system that we've been trying to counter and failing for 20 years. So I think systems is my summary. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. Completely agree with you on the graphic representation. Paola.
Hello, my name is Paola Barragan. I head the USAID-funded Public Procurement Investment Project, Transparency and Accountability Public Procurement Investment Project in Peru. So while I was thinking about the question, I just wanted to lay out very quickly, we promote integrity networks in 5 regions in Peru, composed of private sector, civil society, and government officials. To reduce, opportunities for corruption in public procurement, particularly in public infrastructure. And we went through a very interesting sort of phase where we reached out to all the chambers of commerce of the regions where we were working, and we went there and we said, listen, why don't you become part of this integrity network? And they were like, yeah, we don't have an infrastructure committee, we're not really interested. So we sort of left that road for a while, and then we started working specifically with contracting companies. And then some associations were the associations of engineers and architects of each region where we work in. And then just recently, and so this is sort of the actionable next step for us, we were able to identify an incentive for the chambers of commerce to be part of the process that we're trying to promote. And that was that there has been elections in the country. New governors are going to take oath in January of next year, and basically, there's sort of a narrative that went to say, okay, listen, as a chamber of commerce, what is the most important thing to you? And the answer was to drive the economy, just because we're post-pandemic and whatnot. Okay, so what drives the economy in the regions? Well, public investment projects. Okay, so why don't we do a tool that will help you as a Chamber of Commerce be an actor in identifying and prioritizing those public investment projects that will move the economy faster, quicker, as soon as the new governors take oath. And so our actionable next step is now in coalition with the Chambers of Commerce, the National Confederation of Private companies, a specific civil society organization made of companies that are working on integrity, that are committed to integrity, plus control the Supreme Audit Institution, plus these civil society organizations, to try to see if, now that we have this opportunity for new governors, to be able to then, the next step would be, okay, we have the prioritized public investment projects, then we can use the different methodologies that we've been using to reduce the opportunities for corruption, and then have sort of a joint plan on how to go about this in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So I think that's, what we've learned is that it's incentives. It's two things. It's what are the incentives of those folks that you're trying to get into the table, one, and two, what is the narrative of, how does each sector communicate about these things? Integrity networks doesn't really mean anything to the private sector, so it is about the economy, it is about efficiency, it is about how they can have a market, a part of the market, but do it, with those that really want to do things right.
Thank you, Paola. Let's see if there's anyone from the back, just because I can't really see. All right, I see a gentleman back there with his hand up, all the way at the very back.
Thank you very much. Very insightful submissions there. My name is Mary Awelanada. I work with the Transparency International chapter in Ghana. Most of my points have been spoken to around trust and ensuring that things happen. But I just wanted to add that another area where we can bring on board everybody to work very well is through the ensuring that there is purposive, intentional strategizing in our frameworks. For instance, in Ghana, we have an anti-corruption plan, which we call the National Anti-Corruption Action Plan. And in the planning and strategizing for its adoption, everybody was on board to ensure that we put together the document. And we also ensure that we are assigning roles to each and every partner. Then we put in place mechanisms to as well monitor how implementation is going. So therein, we have all the elements to ensure that we are implementing, but also to ensure that we also have the capacity to be doing that is equally very critical for all of us implementing anti-corruption. We realize that another way is to ensure that we let civil society, particularly, which I belong to, let the public sector and the private sector get aware that we are coming to the table with the necessary capacity and also with the necessary approaches to support. Therein, they accept us and we work together as equal partners. Otherwise, the public sector continues to see civil society as those who are making noise. We are continuing to oppose every intervention and every policy they come up with. When we do that, it is very difficult to engender their trust and to engage them. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So we're almost at the end. I'm going to just turn to a comment that came in online that I also think is really important as we sort of wrap this session up. We've talked a lot about ways to build these partnerships too, but I also think that it's important. This is a really important comment on embedding sectoral understanding and deep dives into governance programming and into anti-corruption programming. I'll just say that on our end, we've used the terms for our guide and this line of work very deliberately, countering corruption across sectors, no longer integration, because we are trying to bring forth the idea that this is a two-way street. This is not just about us pushing anti-corruption work into everyone else's work, but it's about anti-corruption experts and practitioners understanding the sectoral implications and the way that this really plays out. And so I think this is a really important tool about embedding sectoral deep dives into traditional governance programs, whether it's supreme audit institutions and understanding in PFM, for example, what does that actually look like, in education or whatever, in judicial reform. And even as we look at localization, ensuring that this is also understood in terms of how it plays out and how the decentralization environment actually can help steer us in terms of entry points. So we've had a lot of fantastic ideas here, so many, in fact, that I'm wondering if there's a way to capture it. I think the step forward is to take these actions into practice. I'm going to turn for a very brief, like maybe 30-second response from each of our panelists on what your top action is coming out of this meeting today in terms of broadening partnerships and spurring collective action. So we'll just go down the line, maybe starting with Juhani.
I suppose the top point for me would be to learn, for all of us in the anti-corruption community, to learn how to translate our priorities into a language that is appreciated by the sectors, because I think sometimes we have the habit of hitting away at the importance of transparency and accountability and how there's nothing more crucial in the world, and people who are equally as passionate about their own sectors don't always appreciate being lectured that way. And so for us to understand how it translates into more efficiently achieving their own goals, I think is a crucial key in terms of effectively promoting cross-sectoral programming.
Thanks so much. Son? Yeah. I think for me it would be internal advocacy and framing around making the case for investing in the opportunity cost for our people within our organizations and around the world to be empowered to engage in partnership with non-traditional actors. And to your point, leveraging, harmonizing how we, like the parameters we put around our structures and our processes that allow us to galvanize learning so that we really are a coalition, that we really are tackling this together. Yeah, I think that would be it.
Great. Well, not too far off from previous points, but yeah, those unusual suspects. Who is not represented in the spaces that we are trying to influence, and how can we bring them in a way that incentivizes their engagement and in a way that resonates with the issues that they care about? So I think thanks for everyone's inputs, and happy to connect again soon.
Yeah, I have two ideas that I'd like to take it into actions. The first one is that I would like to maybe work together with the TNRC teams and USAID to conduct a study on the political economy of natural resource corruptions in Greater Mekong sub-regions. So that would help us to understand all the players and all the dynamics that happens, so then we would be able to plan further on what can be done and what actors and players can be involved. And second is that I love the idea of this IACC so much that I discussed with the team that maybe we should organize one like this in the ASEAN region. And then I actually ran into the representative of National Anti-Corruption Commission of Thailand in this conference. And we had some discussion that we would be discussing about maybe doing something together going back. So that may be regionalizing what we're discussing here into the context in the regions. So those are the two things that came to my mind. I don't necessarily have the funding to implement it yet, but I think we can discuss further on how we can implement it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we've had so many good ideas today, and I'll just add to the final points that are here, two that I really think are worth stressing that came out in all of the comments we heard today. The idea around creating a safe space or an openness to including others in this conversation, as well as a safe space for implementers and donors to talk about this issue honestly, bravery. We have a comment in here from online saying, break the silence, right? The idea of giving people permission, so to speak about this issue and knowing that they have allies in other sectors in order to help them make their case. The other piece around systems mapping, whether it's graphic, which I personally love, or just the idea of understanding the way all of these corruption challenges are working together and therefore identifying those entry points. And then this really critical piece about communications, which so many people here highlighted, learning how to make that advocacy case and bring people on and build those incentives. And I'll just end with a plug on today, which is, of course, International Anti-Corruption Day. Happy International, I don't know if that's a happy thing, but happy International Anti-Corruption Day. Which is that I really hope that when we meet next, this conference is filled with many more sectoral colleagues than we have seen today. We have some sectors which are highly represented. I think that's fantastic. I'd like to see our energy and infrastructure folks here. I'd like to see our education folks in water and sanitation. And so I think we need more of that, and I think we need to go to their conferences. And we need to be there. We need to be representative. So this is not an exclusive community. I think nobody here feels that way. But we have an opportunity, I think, whether it's a regional representation or sectoral representation, to make sure we are getting the word out and building those constituencies. So thank you so much for joining our session today. I know it was early. The link to our guide is here. We are happy to talk to you about it. There are members from the Anti-Corruption Task Force here, and all of us can stick around for a little while if we've got additional questions. But thank you for joining us.